Welcome to the conference. Yeah. Interwoven societies. Why, what, how? This conference, as I said, wants to explore the broader impact of textile industries on societies across time, but in this conference, especially with a pre-modern focus, which is actually often not the case in Europe because we have a lot of people who work on antiquity and prehistoric times. So I think we are actually one of the late ones in our conference here. Yeah, we want to look a bit back further. I think we all know that these days textiles are discussed a lot, right? Sustainability, climate crisis, of course, but working conditions as well, supply chains and so forth. But this is a discussion, and I don't need to tell you all of that, that reaches much, much longer back than current discussions sometimes make us believe. And so we wanted to explore these different aspects of textile economies, I would say, throughout history, with all the wondrous papers that we'll hear in the next days. We asked for papers just to those maybe hopefully listening online, and also to remind maybe all of us, we wanted to look back to look at different aspects, of course, and in our call we specifically asked for papers that would go deeper into consumption, the expanding consumption via the market and trade, so commercialization of textiles over time, because obviously textile production has also been a home craft, like just for own consumption for a long time, but this transition towards a market economy, you would say. The role of textiles in urbanization and specialization processes, which is very important. The technical and other innovations in production and trade, organization of production processes is something that is very much also within the history of textiles. Of course, working conditions. Then again, we have at least one speaker who's also in the cost action work, which is dealing exactly also with working conditions, and I think we have a nice overlap between both cost action in this aspect of textile economies and interwoven societies. The emergence and nature of supply chains very closely connects to that. It's also an aspect that we invited you to speak about. The quality of relationships between regions and continents, and that I find is quite interesting, and that is partly why we called this conference Interwoven Societies, because it's not just our relationship within one community, but textiles are quite special in that they really tie together the whole globe. Today at least, and at least since the 16th century, if not before, when it comes to textile production and trade. How the textile industry influences economic policies on the larger scale very closely connects to that, of course. EU policy deals with which textile products may be imported into the European Union, under which conditions, and other large-scale policies are still, of course, dealing with textiles today, but they do go back, as we all know, centuries. I'm working on the German Hanse. We are at the German Hanse, Museum, the European Hanse Museum, which very much wants to focus, actually, also on this kind of policy making, right? That is basically what the Hanseatic League existed for centuries. So that, of course, a topic that is very close to my own heart and desk, I would say. Then, of course, the role of textiles in growth and welfare of societies, which is, again, closely linked to the other points I mentioned. And, of course, that is a point I think that has been discussed more in detail, especially in historical and history and archaeology in recent years and decades, the establishment and enforcement of gender roles through textiles. That, of course, is like topics of equality, of course, but also the division of labor and actually which kind of labor is actually integrated into industrial processes. So many, many big topics here, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I will. I can't wait to hear a lot of those papers and to learn more also about other areas of Europe, for example, and of course other times as well, because we're stretching quite far. We are, as I said, focusing here on the first age of commercialization, I would say. I mean, you can, I guess, call it differently. You could say a pre-industrial age, maybe, especially, but not exclusively, of course. And this is a time in which we experience an expansion of markets, and that makes it so interesting that comparatively in Europe's history, a lot is happening in a rather short time in terms of the development of society, economy, and, of course, textiles as an industry. So, what we're going to do today, I want to start with, as I shown Oh, yeah, okay. Here. Why is that not moving? Well, never mind. First wanted to look a bit more generally into the conference topic again, like a bit of the background of textiles and how they shape societies and social and economic developments. And then, of course, I want to talk a bit about Hanse history, though less Hanse, but more textile production and how it's linked to societies, which is less results than more like thoughts on the topic to warm us up a little bit to the topic and the papers that follow. And then, of course, drawing some observations. First, I wrote some conclusions, but that seemed a bit far-fetched at this point at the conference, so I thought let's start with some thoughts, right? This is today, technology and I are not friends. Dum, dum, dum. So first, then again, all of you know, so maybe you could even correct this little slide of mine, but I wanted to still give us kind of a framework of when we talk about interwoven societies and changes in textile industries, what are we actually talking about in the pre-modern period? This is a period in which, a lot changes, as I said, in a rather short time in comparison to maybe other millennia in human history, but of course nothing compared as we perceive it in comparison to the last, let's say, 50 to 100 years. But still, to just get us started, give us a framework, what I find quite interesting and important in my area of research, that in the 13th century we do have a commercial revolution, long distance trade increases, which obviously relates closely to the volume of production and the type of production. Some centers, I will talk about Flanders in a minute, have been starting to produce for European markets at this time, and of course this also established quite a few trade routes. I mean, Hanse trade, for example, some of the basic trade connections, they do start in this century with textile trade. So it is very much defining economic structures to a certain degree as well. Then, of course, we do have the 14th century, which then again is often like maybe not the happiest of times for humanities with the plague waves, obviously, but on the other hand, demographic change, as we all know, also means shifts in society. And for textiles, that's a very important period, I would say, because I think a lot of our research actually starts afterwards, because this does change the socio-economic patterns in Europe. I worked on textile and on linen trade particularly, which really takes off afterwards because there are just more consumers who can afford commercialized production. So a huge shift that really means that textiles diversify, and all over Europe textile industries also change and transform. And with them, regions and societies, obviously. Well, the 15th century for me is an interesting period, and the 15th and 16th, I'm looking forward to discuss it with a lot of you, all of you, because I think there's a lot of happening. It's not that such a big trend like in the second half of the 14th century, but there is a lot of institutional development. There are discussions about proto-industrial development, of course, in economic history, literature, which impacts how societies live together on a larger scale. And from my Hanse perspective, there's a lot of development in terms of how are textiles actually traded, which institutions actually define textile trade. So, I mean, here I fade out in the 16th century, which might annoy a few of you who are working on later periods. But for me, of course, this is a period, again, of profound change with basically a globalizing trade. Of course, cotton industries become much more important or important in global trade. Dyestuffs are more and more traded really across the Atlantic as well, which changes production profoundly. Of course, cotton is also then increasingly used in also in production from the Americas, but also, as I said, cotton production that comes over from India to Europe and really creates an interwoven globe, as one exhibition years ago called it. So this is a bit of the framework that we are moving within, I think. I'm happy if you have more to add to this little, very short overview later on. And I think what is important for me is just maybe for me, a dynamic that I find quite important in our topic is to move between textiles being a transformative force, bring about change, profound change in societies, but on the other hand, they also show a lot of continuity. We all work on regions that often have a very long tradition, Portugal, Westphalia, like of course Switzerland or the Bodensee, like that region of southern Germany, have centuries of history of textile production. With the antiquity, actually, I'm not that firm on that part. I hope to learn more about that. But it is interesting that on the one hand, so much changes within the industry, and on the other hand, certain regions just like stick to it over centuries, which obviously is a very long time. And only in the last century, with textile industry moving more and more to other parts of the world, did it disappear more and more from Europe, actually. So a very long-standing history has also profoundly changed, more or less recently. Yeah, so now the interesting question could be, then again, we are EuroWeb, right? So why textiles is probably kind of a bad question. But still, I mean, it's an interesting question. Why is it textiles that are so transformatory, that actually change societies maybe more than other commodities? Then again, I guess there are many, many books you could consult on that. I chose to consult Robert Lopez, who wrote a book on the commercial revolution. As I said, this part of European history where it kind of, in most economic history handbooks, that's where it starts, right? Urbanization, specialization, and long-distance trade in textiles really takes off there, and basically provides us with a starting point for the development that we still see today within Europe, or so until recently. Just to maybe read it out loud, textile industries have been pacemakers of industrial progress at least twice in the last 1,000 years. As a matter of fact, certain technological and organizational developments in the cotton industry of the 18th century started the industrial revolution that is still with us. Developments of the same kind, if not the same size, in the wool industry of the 12th century initiated the pre-industrial rise of the Middle Ages. So this is kind of a strong claim of what textiles actually did for European development, exactly at the beginning, at the end, sort of the period that we are focusing on here. And I think to see this initiation, of course, here very much tied to also technological change. In the 13th century, the horizontal loom, which is not too complicated, but still was very important technology. And then, of course, industrial change. That is, of course, a technological force that really brought about transformation, but it has a lot to do also with, as we know, population and other factors. And in between, of course, there are many, many other changes, especially of organizational nature. Supply chain is maybe a key word here, proto-industrial organization that really changed how Europe works. And that is very much closely tied to the textile industry, not least because the textile industry has certain hallmarks he points out in his book that maybe make them special in their impact on society, which is that actually textiles are very easily highly differentiated, and so they can maximize the potential demand. So they can really address very, very different consumers if consumers are then consuming via the market, of course. It is a simple technology which makes it easier to implement it all over different societies, right? It is not as such very much linked to certain locations as well. The production is very easily broken down into many different steps, starting from, of course, spinning, over then weaving, even wool washing, I think, can be its own craft, and then, of course, down to shearing, fulling, and whatnot. So many, many different steps that can very easily be separated from one another, which is important to exploit division of labor, but also to exploit wage differences, because textiles are quite light. So actually, low transportation transaction costs, support that textiles can actually, the textile production can actually be kind of, optimized, or wage labor can be exploited. You can frame it whatever way you want, but that is something that is also quite unique in comparison to, for example, metal production and metalwork, which is much more location-bound. And the interdependence of those production stages actually promotes the reintegration under one management. It's the merchant capitalist that often is a transformative figure in textile industries over time. And that is an interesting maybe dynamic between very fragmented production steps and actually having one persona or one group of agents who can be quite transformative and push about or bring about a larger industry, design a larger industry with capital, which then again means that there must be a supply of a surplus of capital to bring this forward. This, of course, links into social discourses of textile production. Of course, how the sumptuary laws would be linked to the differentiability of textiles, but of course, especially the discussion about the price of labor, fairness, of course, but also power plays, political hierarchies that are often highly debated within urban communities when it comes to textile production, also between town and countryside. So political dynamics are also at play, and of course, questions of standardization in long-distance trade, and of course, interdependencies between different economic areas. I should be a bit quicker, I think. This is just to highlight again that this, of course, is very much tied to other factors as well. For example, urbanization is very important, and change often has also to do with changes in population. That, for the fun of it, I just made a map showing a bit urbanization, like urban centers sort of in Europe. This is data from another project I'm working on where we're mapping pre-modern transport routes. Of course, then you need city data for it as well. So you can see, I mean, Europe is at the time that we're talking about highly urbanized. A lot of the settlements that we know today actually were founded in that period. So we do have a higher urban density, and of course, normally where we have a higher clusters of urban centers, that would also be where industry would more likely be situated. Okay, I need to be a bit quicker. Let's go into Hanse, which is, okay or not. Why? Hello? Why I don't understand? Hello? Yeah, okay. There's no logic to it really, but I just very quickly wanted to give a few examples of, like one study on Flanders that I recently read that maybe is a nice example of how it actually looks then in a case study, these interwoven societies. One on Flanders, because Flanders is just so important in this first phase of commercialization of European textile industries. And then looking a bit into Osnabrück, which is just like a personal favorite, and also as we are actually showing like one textile sample from Osnabrück, from this case that I'm talking about in our exhibition that we'll see later. Those of you who are here, the ones that are listening online, I'm afraid you have to come back another time. So very quickly, just to give you an idea, this is basically the production centers that are represented in Hanse trade, so basically especially Baltic trade, but also of course down to Central Europe. This is something I'm working on, just trying to figure out actually which centers, which kind of products are within Hanse trade. The pink ones are linen production centers, which are notoriously hard to track in the literature though, so it must be many more. And the blue ones are of course woolen cloth producing centers. And up here, this is just to give you an impression of the differentiality, never mind, the variety of products. Because we have some sources that actually give us quite an impression of that we have a few very high quality products, but especially in the period that we're working on. Of course, we have everything from luxury to like medium upper class sort of stuff, and then increasingly also rough, like everyday clothes or something that cities buy to clothe their officials with, which is normally the cheap stuff, to be honest. This is just to give you an impression, and of course, as you can see here, Flanders is quite important in that trade. Where is it now? Hello. Yeah, there. Flanders is quite important in that trade, has been since the 13th century for all of European textile trade, but for Hanse trade especially because the Hanse merchants had a trading post in Bruges and had very close relationships with a lot of Flemish producers, even having exclusive rights on productions of whole cities, of whole towns. And that, of course, is a very strong connection and actually leads to the Flemish textile industry staying important in Baltic trade longer than in other areas of Europe, talking about interwoven societies, right? Whereas in other parts, English and Dutch production was gaining in the market share, I would say, within the Baltic regions, then Hanse merchants would normally try to stick to their products, the Flemish textiles. So a close relationship, so it's one of the reasons why it's a good example to look into. Oops, that, no, too quick. And this is a case, I haven't really worked on it myself, but recently read the book, and if you read a good book, you can also use that instead of spending months doing something similar, right? Jim van der Meulen has recently published his book, Woven into the Urban Fabric, Cloth Manufacture and Economic Development in the Flemish West Quarters, especially in that period that I'm talking about. And what is interesting here for our topic is that in this period, there's a very deep transformation of social relationships, economic relationships, of course, as well, in Flanders, especially in the 15th and 16th centuries. And it is, and this is a very much discussed dynamic, as we know, the dynamic, especially between town and countryside. You can see here that that urban drapery was first leading in textile production in Flanders, but over the period that we're talking about, actually the share of rural draperies rises remarkably. Textile production altogether drops, which is, of course, a problem economically speaking for the region, but within the region, rural production gains much in importance. So there is this is a period that is quite interesting in the context of our conference, because we can see that not only did new products emerge, which I'm normally focusing on, but this really changes Flanders. It's not a big region, right? And within that region, you have a high clustering of textile production centers. And if new production centers pop up, this is obviously something that challenges the economic design of the region. Which it partly does. More importantly, it also transforms those centers from rural societies into quasi-urban societies. The difference, again, and that might be something interesting to discuss as well, is not that clear-cut, because villages and cities in the Middle Ages are actually sometimes not even that different. But still, the way that the society works is quite different, because at the end of the period, at the latest in the 16th century, these communities are specialized on textile production. They are not focusing on agricultural labor and also producing textiles, but basically their main occupation is textile production. So they do transform into a different sort of economy, and also adapt then more urban lifestyle, as he can show in his book. So this is quite, then again, it is a couple of 100 years, so it's not suddenly, but it's still a lasting transition in that area. And of course, that would mean less agricultural production. That is something I haven't looked into, and he hasn't neither, as far as I can tell. Means that, of course, agricultural produce needs to probably come from somewhere else, right? Because the economic profile of the region has shifted. This is just an example, a nice example, I think, to show how the demand for textiles that rose in the 14th and 15th century, as I said, really changes how people lived also. And then again, it is important also because a lot of the production was actually dependent on, for example, wool imports. There are interesting dynamics at play. The production that has risen in the Low Countries in that period was less dependent on English wool, which is, as we all know, or probably all know, the main raw material to produce high-quality textiles in that time, but they chose to actually produce with Scottish and Spanish wool. Why is that? It's quite interesting to see that at the same time, in the 15th century, when those industries emerge, English wool does pose quite a problem for other Flemish textile producers because of English wool, like fiscal policy. Actually, the price of wool goes up so high that it makes up 60% or more of the production costs. It leads to actually large-scale unemployment in, for example, Holland, Leiden. There has been studies on it in that period, so in the 1430s onwards, and to a crisis of the whole region. I mean, large-scale unemployment because of the availability of wool. Again, a case of interwoven societies. English, let's say, political goals have a feedback on wool prices, have a feedback on societies that are reliant on this wool to actually produce their product. Then, of course, okay, why not just use another wool? Merino wool gets better and better in the period. On the other hand, of course, there are then Hanse merchants who actually try to exclude cloth made from Spanish wool or Scottish wool partly from their trade area. And as they have recurring political conflicts with Scotland and also Spain, they also often pose trade bans on trade in those textiles. So you can see there's producers were actually really between a rock and a hard place at many times between economic considerations, product design, and political conflicts. Now I really have to hurry up. Just to give us a quick example from the other big textile industry of the time, or like part of textile industries, because I talked about woolen cloth, and for the most part of the period that we're talking about here, it is mostly about woolen cloth and linen cloth, right? These are the products that are produced on a large scale, and these are the products that, to a certain degree, shape Europe's, they are the textile industry that shapes Europe, so to speak. And an example for such quite an important production region is Westphalia, that actually has a millennium of linen production history, which is quite interesting to see that actually from the 9th, 10th century, first in a more of a territorial, seigneurial context as duties to the lord, and then from the 13th, 14th century more in an urban setting, and then of course later in an industrial setting. This industry shapes this region profoundly. Katrin can tell you more about it because she is from that area, and there are still quite a few museums of the industrial history of the area, which are to a great part actually focusing on textiles and textile production. And only in the 20th century and early 21st, I think even, some of the industries closed. And there was still rural linen weaving in Westphalia in the 20th century. So talk about long-term impacts on society. Westphalia is a very good example for that. What is important in our context is that here, more than with the example I presented before, town and countryside were in a sort of very closely knit together. Before, when I talked about rural textile production, it was still village productions, it was still larger settlements. Here in Westphalia, these numbers represent the textiles that were certified in Osnabrück according to urban standards. These textiles were produced by individual rural weavers who would produce maybe 2 or 3 pieces of linen per year. So only a side business to their agricultural work. So this creates, of course, a completely different dynamic from the dynamic that we've been shortly looking into before in Flanders. Because here the weavers are much more dependent on one hand. On the other hand, they are less dependent because it's not their sole occupation. But still, they don't have the same power and they don't have market access, which is very important to consider when you consider their living conditions and how they relate to a global trade in Osnabrück linen, for example. Osnabrück linen were, from the 16th century on, traded to the New World as well. So a weaver sits somewhere in the hinterland of Osnabrück, produces 2 or 3 pieces of linen that might reach the Americas. And that, I think, is an interesting hierarchy of levels that are interconnected, interwoven. And of course, these actors never really meet each other, but they have quite different motives for how they work. Merchants, long-distance trade merchants, and weavers, for example. Just very quickly, a case that I want to look into a bit more in the future, and maybe all of you give me good ideas in the next few days how to also look into this in greater detail, is a case where this production is discussed quite intensely. We are showing exactly this piece, I think, in our exhibition here, because it is a discussion about not fraud, but imitation of the Osnabrück seal and product in the area, which, and this document, I chose a few examples from it to just highlight the discussion in the sources about interwoven societies, you might say. One thing is that they actually emphasize a lot that this is of public interest, this production, and that therefore it needs to be discussed on the highest level between urban representatives and authorities and nobility even, and that it is something that if this textile production is not protected in its reputation, then this would lead to harm to the whole region. And I think that very early in these documents highlights how aware people were about the impact of something like a bad quality seal having on the whole region, because in the Americas nobody would, they had to rely on such identification marks, of course, and on toponyms, which was the topic, incidentally, of Joanna's and my own last conference. So it's kind of a build-up, I would say. And of course, this also highlights how important the relation between town and countryside is, because this reputation building took place in the cities. And products that were actually certified in Osnabrück by the Lege, by the institution there, by the public show of linens, was quite important to transform a product of a craftsman into a commodity for long-distance trade. And this transformation process is, of course, something where the weaver had, let's say, mixed interests in adhering to all standards, but the certifying institution, of course, had to make sure that this product could be successful on international markets. And there's also an interesting discussion about labor, because actually this source is one of the few that I know. Marco maybe can help me out a bit with other examples, because I haven't also looked that much into this particular topic, where they also discuss labor and what it means for the people to actually be embedded in this kind of international industry. It's kind of, because there is a discussion whether or not they get the best prices for their product, and if, for example, merchants on the countryside pay more or less than in the city, because somebody seems to have claimed that merchants go to the countryside and pay more than at the market, which is very quickly basically called nonsense, because why would anybody, and that's the quote in German, why would anybody not follow his human weakness and try to get less, try to pay less for the product? This source also discusses how it's just not very feasible for merchants to travel to the market more than 3 or 4 times a year and actually go there when the price is right. Travel a distance of 60 kilometers to maybe sell 1 or 2 pieces of linen cloth. And that is something that is not really feasible for the rural population, which is why they don't necessarily want to go to the sort of staple market where the goods can be certified and they might get higher prices. Discussions like this, I think, show us quite well that it's worth looking into the different sets of relationships of this hierarchical system of textile societies or textile industries on different levels. I think it is interesting also to kind of try to mix up, as I try to do at least a bit now in my introductory remarks, mix a bit between micro studies and really looking into what individual actors say about their situation, and macro level observations of how dynamics work between rural producers, between merchants, between consumers, obviously, because they do play a role as well, between policy-making institutions and so forth. So there are quite a few players and groups of agents involved, and they all have their own different sets of, I called it an agency framework. They all have their own, very own incentives, but also possibilities in how they act within the economic framework of the time. And this is, of course, an interesting question: to which degree are they actually able to change the framework in which they operate, or change the conditions in which trade takes place? Yeah. And I think, yeah, basically that is it from me. Let me just see. Why? Well, I can leave it at that. So basically, these were my thoughts to maybe get us started. I'd be happy if you want to comment on it, or if we could have a small discussion. And of course, as we're a bit delayed, then of course we will soon move on to our discussion. I think I'll actually hand the mic to Joanna, who will then moderate us also through the rest of the day. But of course, you're also free to ask questions. Thank you.